Okay, welcome everybody. I'll say off the top that we're going to save time at the end of this event for questions and answers in the audience. So please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And you can start asking questions anytime you like. Our topic today is China's remarkable steps in October to commemorate the 70th anniversary of China's entry into the Korean War. There was a big speech by Xi Jinping, his visit to a special exhibition at the Military Revolution Museum, an honoring of surviving Chinese veterans of the Korean War, and new movies and television programs. So what are we to make of all that? Fortunately for us, we have Yoon Sun of the Stimson Center, one of the most astute observers of China, to explain it to us. So I guess my first question, Yoon, would be whether it's unusual for China to be commemorating their entry into a war that was already going on. Is that odd? Or aren't they waiting to celebrate the end of the war?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me. And thank you for the very insightful questions. I think for the Chinese and for China, the concept of the Korean War and the Chinese concept of the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea are two different concepts. So for the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea, the primary party has been, it was China, especially the PRC government that was only formally established in the October of the previous year. And for the Korean War, the primary party to begin with was North Korea and South Korea. And then that was expanded to the United States, to the UN Army, and then to China. So for China, what the Chinese are commemorating is not the Korean War. It's a war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea. So I think for the Chinese, this very different concept means that the beginning is very different, it's a different date, and the ending is also very different, it's also a very different date. So for the Chinese, what they are commemorating is almost a historical mission in the Chinese narrative to fight the Americans, to help the North Koreans. And more importantly, there's also the term 保家卫国, which is to protect the motherland and to guard China's territorial sovereignty. So therefore, for China, the breaking out of the Korean War on June 25th in 1950 was not the most important date for the Chinese. But the Chinese entry into the Korean War on October 25th in 1950, that suggests a significant change to China's foreign policy at that point. And for China, the Korean War, or the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea, is regarded as a war that consolidated China. It protected or ascertained the safety and the security and the non-viability of the new China. And it also is a war that consolidated China's international status as a great regional power. So as for the question, why is China not celebrating or commemorating the ending of the war? First, for the Korean War, it has not ended yet, because in 1953 we had an armistice, but the armistice has not yet been replaced by a peace agreement or peace mechanism. And there's not the normalization of relations between US and North Korea and between North Korea and South Korea. So therefore, when the Chinese talk about the three agenda or the three goals coming to the Korean Peninsula, stability, peace, and denuclearization, the definition of peace is extremely clear. It is how to end the Korean War and to completely achieve the peace, not only in the legal sense, but also in the political and military sense. And the last question is, why are the Chinese not commemorating the end of the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea? I think that's a very good question. That's a question that people don't look at very often. Because for China, the ending of the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea, it was a long process of 5 years. From 1953 to 1958, the Chinese volunteer army stayed in North Korea for another 5 years. And it was not until October of 1958 did the Chinese army finally withdrew from North Korea. So of course, at the beginning, there was a purpose for them to stay, to stabilize the situation, to help reconstruction of North Korea. But the reason that they were forced to leave in the end was because of the internal political struggle in North Korea. If you remember, after the armistice was signed, Kim Il-sung started to purge the pro-Soviet Soviet faction and the pro-China Yan'an faction within the Korean Workers' Party, which directly led to the defection of the Yan'an faction to China. And at that point, Kim Il-sung was still demanding Beijing to send these people back to North Korea. And in the end, the compromise was that China would withdraw its army and North Korea would drop the question of the Yan'an faction defectors. So what that means is that the Chinese withdrawal from North Korea was not a particularly glorifying ending. And I think that's part of the reason why the Chinese don't like to talk about that particular event. Thank you.
No, that's very helpful. Is anything strike you about the way the Chinese are describing the Korean War during this commemoration? Is it the way they've always described the Korean War? I mean, I was struck by the fact that during his fairly long speech, Xi Jinping mentioned Mao Zedong by name. He never mentioned Kim Il-sung.
Yes, you're right. The speech was first very long. It was 38 minutes to begin with. And for anyone who read that speech, I think people would be particularly struck by the fact of the hawkish and the nationalistic tone that Xi's speech has conveyed this time. But this hawkish and nationalistic tone has also gained Xi much praise and support and positive reception among the Chinese netizens and loyal pundits. I think for Xi, the primary message is not about Korea. It's not about the Korean War, and it's not about the Korean Peninsula. It's more about the U.S.-China relations and what kind of message Beijing is trying to send to Washington at this moment. So his primary message is one of deterrence to the United States, including, for example, I quote, "Through the Korean War, China made the whole world see that China shall not be offended, or the offender will end up in trouble." So I think the implied message there is that, therefore, U.S. should think twice before taking more actions on Taiwan or on the South China Sea. So instead of praising the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, President Xi was much more keen on condemning the United States. The criticisms from his speech are less than tacit, including calling America, he didn't point out the United States, but he said unilateralism, protectionism, selfishness, coercion, blockade, maximum pressure, hegemonism, bullying behaviors on China are not only infeasible, but are also bound to meet their demise. So his interpretation of the Korean War is cause and its result are particularly, I think, alarming at this particular moment, because he drew a rather appalling conclusion that the Korean War was a war that ended all wars for China, because China's entry into the Korean War was not only an act of peace, according to Xi, but also one that won China peace and respect from the United States and the rest of the world for the following several decades. Again, this goes back to the concept that the war to resist American aggression and aid North Korea was a war that consolidated China's status as an independent country, as a non-violable country, and also as a great regional power. So for him, Xi argued that winning the Korean War has protected China from 100 other wars and defended the peace of both Asia and the whole world. So that's pretty much the concept of a war to end wars. And if you think about the implication of that message, I would say it's pretty concerning.
Yeah, it was an extremely China-centric speech. He mentioned fighting alongside the North Korean people a couple of times, but it was about China. And I don't think he ever mentioned Russian involvement, not the Russian pilots or nothing like that. It was all about China. Going back in history again a little bit, during the war years, China insisted that the intervention was being done by the Chinese volunteers, not by the People's Liberation Army. So is that a distinction that still makes any sense or importance to the Chinese?
Not anymore. I know that during the war, that was a distinction that Beijing tried very hard to emphasize, that this is a this is a volunteer army. But I think now everybody knows that this was a decision that was specifically made by Chairman Mao himself. In fact, against the advice of several of his military generals. So it was a decision made on the top level, and it was implemented pretty much through the People's Liberation Army system. So regardless of whether it was called a volunteer army, it was in fact the Chinese state army. So what is called doesn't make a huge difference here. But I think one of the reasons, if you think about it, why did the Chinese insist on calling them the volunteer army? I think some of the Chinese have explained as China was trying not to expand not to broaden the conflict. Now China was trying to control the pace and also the severity of the conflict. But another explanation that I saw that is probably more reasonable was because North Korea requested China for the assistance. Oh. So China in turn volunteered to help. So I think there was it was a relationship between North Korea and how North Korea demanded China to provide that military assistance, and China responded with a positive answer. So I think that concept for the Chinese decision makers are pretty important as well, because it shows that China didn't actively participate in the Korean War. China did not volunteer its army to the Korean War, but instead it was based on the request from the North Korean side. So China was helping.
Okay, that's interesting. During the war, the UN had some question about whether or not China was actually belligerent in the war, and they decided that they were, de facto, no matter what the Chinese government was saying. And then the armistice was signed by a representative of the Chinese volunteer army, I believe, not by the Chinese state. But then China did appear at the 1954 Geneva Conference. So they were admitting that they were a party to the war. But it took a while to settle that, for whatever reason. Different question. I think Americans and South Koreans are pretty direct about describing the outcome of the war as a draw, even though it set the stage for the flourishing of South Korea. The armistice is usually described as an imperfect outcome. Does any of that dissatisfaction appear in Chinese descriptions of the war?
I think it does, but it's less of a regret over, oh, well, how come we didn't crack that? We didn't achieve a better outcome historically, but rather an acceptance of the armistice as a result of the pulling and hauling on the battlefield, and the fact that neither side could gain more advantage in the battlefield, and both sides were exhausted by the time that the armistice were signed. So of course it was an imperfect outcome, but given the circumstances at point, was a better outcome for either side feasible or attainable? I think the answer is probably negative. And the question is for this distinction that the Americans and South Koreans see the Korean War as a draw, but then the Chinese consistently claim that, well, this is a success. This was a victory for China. I think that's also something that's worth looking into. First, I think for the Korean War, since the war has not really ended, as for who really won the war, I think that's going to be a historical question. And I think American side and South Korean side have full reason to describe it as a draw, because armistice in the end, it suggested was a draw. But I think for China, this comes back to that different concept between the difference between the Korean War and the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea. Because for China, for that war, they won. Because they were able to resist Americans. They pushed the American soldiers back to the 38th parallel. They made sure that the American warplanes and American soldiers did not cross the Yellow River. They provided assistance to North Korea. And they also, in the Chinese concept, defended the peace and the sovereignty of the Chinese, the northeast three provinces of China. So from that perspective, I think the Chinese do see themselves as victorious. And the second point about why the Chinese see this as a victory, I think is because of the result of the war. We now know that the North Korean Kim Il-sung, when he decided to launch the attack against the South Koreans in June of 2015, 1950, he himself did not obtain the approval or the support or the support from Mao Zedong. And for China, the goal of the war to resist Americans and to help North Koreans, it was not to help the North Koreans to claim South Korea. And in the end, the demilitarization zone around the 38th parallel primarily returned the status to the pre-war status. So still two Koreas, and the territories are still divided. But from the Chinese argument, North Koreans were not wiped out in this as a result in the end of this war, and North Korea was not absorbed by South Korea. So from this perspective, the Chinese goal of assisting North Korea was also achieved. But the Chinese never supported the North Korean goal to take over South Korea to begin with. So depends on how we judge the result of the war. And last but not least, I think for the Chinese, although there's very little tactical or territorial gains by the time that the armistice was signed, I think the Chinese have always emphasized more on the symbolic and the political significance of this war. So like I mentioned, this war is regarded as a consolidation of China as a nation and consolidation of China's status as a regional power. And since then, the Chinese see themselves as having gained the respect and having gained mostly respect from world powers, including the United States. So for China, Korean War is a process of validation. It's a validation of China's power status and China's ability to fight a war to protect its own national interest. Especially for China, they would like to emphasize that by the time that the Korean War broke out, United States still enjoyed the strongest defense industry, nuclear weapons, and also had the support of the whole free world as the leader of the free world. So United States at that point, after the World War II, was one of probably the strongest country in the world. And at that time, in comparison, People's Republic of China was only in existence for less than a year. And the comprehensive national power and also the defense technology or defense capability are nowhere near where the United States was. So given this tremendous gap, this power gap between China and the United States, I think for the Chinese, the fact that they were able to prevent the United States from achieving its stated goals, and in the end, it ended up with the armistice, that is pretty successful from the Chinese perspective. So when you are the absolutely disadvantaged party in the war, not losing is winning. So I think for the Chinese mentality, there's a lot of interpretation in that regard. Thank you.
No, that's right. I think it comes through in the speech too, because Xi Jinping does talk about the fact that they proved that the American military was not invincible. So they were already taking the perspective, even today, that they were taking on a mighty force and won by through their virtuous intervention.
True.
And I think the Korean perspective is important too, because even at the outbreak of the war, the North Koreans didn't believe they were invading a foreign country. They thought they were moving into part of their own country that was being held by a rebel regime. And the armistice certainly marked an end to hostilities, but not an end to the struggle over who's going to control the peninsula. I think they both thought that the fighting was stopping, but it was not resolved. And so Lee Sung-man and Kim Il-sung both thought they were going to be able to get back to it at some point.
That was, well, after Xi Jinping's speech, I think State Department had a very strong rebuttal saying that, well, remember, it was two sovereign nations, North Korea and South Korea at the time, and North Korea attacked South Korea. And the Chinese reaction was, well, that was a civil war. That was between two Koreas. That was not regarded as a foreign aggression. I think that that concept or that belief still lingers on in the Chinese interpretation of what happened.
Yeah, topic for another day. Was it civil war or was it an international war? That's we can talk about that. I'm not sure how many Americans are aware that Mao Zedong's son, Mao Anying, was killed during the Korean War. Is that a well-known fact in China? And is he portrayed as a hero or as a victim of the war?
Oh, that fact is very well known in China because Mao Zedong has 4 known sons, and Mao Anying was the only one that was psychologically, only surviving son that was psychologically normal. 2 of the known sons died or disappeared, were lost before the founding of the new China. Then the other son, Mao Anjing, he was psychologically problematic since 1940s. So Mao Anying by 1950 was pretty much the only son that was regarded as Mao Zedong's functional heir or functional son. So when he was killed in the Korean War, it was regarded as the selflessness of Mao Zedong. Look at how much sacrifice the supreme leader has done for the protection of China and the protection of North Korea. He devoted his only psychologically normal son to the war, and the son was killed in the war. So that's very well broadcast fact in China. And this year, one of the promotional TV programs even invited the widow of Mao Anying to show up and to talk about how Mao Anying was only 28 years old and was just married before he was sent to Korea, and then he was killed there. So Mao Anying, of course, has been portrayed as a hero in the Chinese narrative, that he was this innocent son that went to North Korea to fight for the North Korean and the Chinese cause, and he was killed by the Americans. So that was pretty much the message. And also the fact that Mao Anying's remains never returned to China, that he was buried in North Korea, is also regarded as a symbol or a sign of the friendship between China and North Korea. But more recently, there are also controversies related to Mao Anying, because, so for example, there's this one very well circulated story, but of course, 70 years later, nobody can really verify, saying that, Mao Anying, the reason that he was killed, or the reason that his location was exposed, was because he was not happy with the tough living condition in North Korea, and he insisted on making himself fried rice when he was in North Korea, and that smoke exposed their location and led to the bombing by the American warplanes. That, of course, cannot be verified, but the fact that this story is well circulated in China, especially among netizens who basically target people who celebrate fried rice on the day of his death, or his day around the date that Xi Jinping gave his speech. I thought that was a pretty good tale of the controversies related to this as well.
That's interesting. I spoke to a Chinese student once who was visiting Washington, and I asked her what they taught Chinese students about the Korean War. And she said it doesn't matter what we were taught. What we all think is that it was a tremendous waste of Chinese lives. And North Koreans are ingrates. And the only good outcome of the war was that Mao Anying got killed, saving us having to live under a Mao dynasty. So it was pretty direct and surprising to me.
Yeah, that's a pretty dark message, I would say. But I would say that as someone who was trained in the Chinese foreign policy apparatus, I went to the Diplomatic Academy of China. The way that the Korean War was described, it was very ambiguous. Like throughout all historical books or historical documents that you can read, including the history textbooks for international relations students, you will never see who started it. You will never see who attacked whom first, because the narrative is almost generic and it's standardized. And it will say, and it does say, that on June 25th, 1950, the Korean War broke out. And I remember back then asking my professor that, well, how did it break out? Who attacked whom? Who took the first action? No answer. That I kept asking, and the answer is, well, don't worry about it. It just out.
It just happened.
It just happened. Don't ask too much. I think there's a very, very straightforward narrative of this issue in the Chinese history.
Okay. My last question before I turn to the audience is, do you think the fact that China and the United States and South Korea and North Korea remember the Korean War so differently makes it more difficult to negotiate now? Can you negotiate a peaceful settlement of the Korean question, as the armistice calls for, when people have such different perspectives on what the war was all about?
That's a great question, Mark. Does historical memory make it more difficult? I think it does make it more difficult because each side remembers the war from their own perspective and from the standpoint of their own national interest. So therefore, I would say that all parties' memory of that war is quite subjective, especially in China and in North Korea. But I think there are also those subjective elements in the American and South Korean description. But I think the eventual peaceful resolution of the Korean question does not depend on the historical memory. It depends on the objective and depends on the realistic national interest. So if all countries believe the peaceful resolution is conducive and in the interest of their nation, then I think the differences with the historical memory can be overcome. And here, one example is, well, look at the Vietnam War. So it was definitely a war that people saw that, well, United States lost. But this has not prevented the United States from reestablishing diplomatic relations with Vietnam. And it has not stopped the two countries from pursuing closer alignment and closer cooperation because there's now a bigger agenda or a shared agenda, which is the threat from China. So I think eventually what decides the peaceful settlement of the Korean question is how countries judge their national interest and whether that settlement is conducive to their national interest. Historical memory can be overcome, but it will only happen when countries believe that such a peaceful settlement is in their interest to begin with.
Okay, it's a hopeful note to end on.
Fingers crossed.
I've got one question's come in from Frank Elm. And Frank asks, did China believe, rightly or wrongly, that the US was going to cross the Yalu as it moved up through North Korea? Would it have intervened if the US was clear they would not cross the Yalu?
That's a great question. I think the Chinese policy community debated that question for quite a few rounds. That because honestly, I think there is an honest reassessment in China about whether the Korean War, whether China's intervention in the Korean War is actually in China's national interest. There are a lot of arguments that yes, it is, because hey, look, China was able to consolidate its independence and consolidate its status. But I think at the same time, people also acknowledge that China lost the opportunity of national unification with Taiwan because of its intervention in the Korean War. So whether the Korean War in the end was a pure gain or was a pure loss for China, that has been a question that, at least in my view, does not have a straight answer among the experts. But one of the arguments is quite clear that from the people who are supporting, who have supported China's role in the intervention in the Korean War, and that is, had China not intervened, U.S. warplanes would cross the Yellow River much more frequently, and in the end, it will violate Chinese sovereignty and also if the North Koreans were completely defeated, they would retreat to China's northeast three provinces and try to start a guerrilla warfare from there. So I think the fact that the Chinese believed that the U.S. intention was to cross the Yellow River played a huge role in the Chinese decision in the end. It may not attest to the fact that actually U.S. actually decided to do that, but it was a perception on the Chinese side that contributed to their determination that we have to intervene.
Yeah, I think you made an excellent point earlier that sometimes Americans forget how soon the Korean War came after China was just finding its feet. I mean, it was a brand new state. It just fought an internal revolution. So trying to find its way in a conflict or in international diplomacy was something brand new for that state. It wasn't as if they had a tradition to fall back on of national positions.
That is very true. That is, I think that is very true. And I think that could support the argument that China was such a new state and China should not have wanted to participate in such a major conflict so early when the country was still barely on its feet, right? But I think for Mao Zedong, his strategic personality played a huge role in this decision, that he decided that, well, although we are a new state, we need this war to show who we really are. And this is a war that stopped all the other wars. And Mao Zedong used this argument that we fight this one fight and it will prevent another 100 fights because the country will be deterred from there. That was his argument, and I see more and more Xi Jinping using the same argument. And the fact that Xi Jinping also used the term that, well, a war to end all other wars is worthwhile. I think that's more about today's situation rather than about the Korean War 70 years ago.
That's very interesting. I mean, you've heard the same case made here from time to time that let's get over with. It'll be harder later. So I've got one more question I'm going to take, even though we're a little bit over time, because Gil Rosman asks, was there an effort in the 1990s to reassess the war, which later was suppressed? It makes me think there's something he knows that he's putting behind that question.
I think Gil must know something. In the 1990s, I think there have been rounds of reviews of what happened in the Korean War and the China's gains and losses from it. I've seen this in the 1990s. I've seen this in the early 2000s, and especially since the North Koreans started to test their nuclear weapons. And using your former Chinese intern's words, the North Koreans turn into ingrates. I think this has stimulated even more debate in China, almost retrospection, as for whether China's effort back in the 1950s were worth it. And one example that I would like to cite here is Professor Shen Zhihua from the Eastern China Normal University. So he has adopted a different archive perspective. So when the Soviet Union disintegrated, he was able to basically go to Moscow and purchased a lot of the national archives related to the Korean War. And he has been using these archives to look into the origins and the motivations of the Korean War and who manipulated whom, basically. And I think his conclusion was very clear, that Mao Zedong was manipulated by both Stalin and Kim Il-sung at the same time. And Mao Zedong was basically coaxed into this into the Korean War, to fight a war for Kim Il-sung that was not in China's interest. So this very detailed description of how manipulation of Mao Zedong happened, I thought that was really the crown jewel from Professor Shen Zhihua's writing. But then it is also my understanding that Professor Shen Zhihua's writing is not welcomed in China, and there have the authorities or pro-authority experts have organized counterattacks on Shen Zhihua's argument or Shen Zhihua's study for years. So I think this reflects that there are retrospections, there are this difference of opinions, but I think it also suggests that the authority or Beijing government is very keen on maintaining one narrative that serves the Communist Party's purpose. And so I foresee this debate, or at least an academic debate, that exists in the intellectual arena will continue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, fortunately, we're not commercial television, so we can run a little bit over if it's okay with you. Marcus Garlauskas asks, does the Chinese Communist Party today portray the Chinese People's Volunteers as trying to unify Korea, or only to defend North Korea and the PRC?
I think the description of the goal of the Chinese Volunteer Army, it was quite clear. It was to aid North Korea, but it doesn't specify aid North Korea to do what. Aid North Korea to take over the whole Korean Peninsula, or just aid North Korea from not being eliminated by the United States and the South Korean armies. But I think the result of the war in the end turned out to be that, well, it turns out that the Chinese and the North Korean, plus the tacit support from Soviet Union, they were not sufficient to help North Korea to achieve the whole occupation, to take over the whole Korean Peninsula. So that was the result that we're seeing today is one that is settled for. If the question is, was when the Chinese volunteer army was first sent into North Korea, was their goal to help North Korea to take over the whole Korean Peninsula. I have not seen historical records or the archive that suggests that was a goal, because in the Chinese narrative, the goal was very much clearly described as 保家卫国, as protect China and protect the Chinese territory, and also assist North Korea. So I think if you ask me to speculate, I think if they had the opportunity to achieve that military victory on the battlefield, they would have. But the fact that they weren't able to do that led to the situation today.
Okay, thank you. Let me finish by asking one more question of my own to kind of get back to the 70th anniversary commemorations. You talked about the motivations of what the speech and the activities. So could you elaborate a little bit more just at the end now on what China was messaging and to whom were they messaging it with all of these 70th anniversary commemorations?
Yeah, so for this, I think for outsiders, one thing to remember is that the politics of the commemoration of the Korean War is that it is never about Korea. The politics of the commemoration of the Korean War is that the bureaucratic level of senior leaders involved, the scale, meaning how many activities are planned on the national level or on the local level, and the seniority of the leaders in attendance. They are more a reflection of the state of the U.S.-China relations rather than a reflection of China's relationship with either Korea. So it is, I call it, it demonstrates a negative correlation with the state of the U.S.-China relations. So when we look at China's, basically, the commemoration that we have seen in the 1960s, 1970s, then in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and then this year, one generalization that we can draw is that when the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China is positive, China tends to minimize, dilute, or neutralize, or downplay the commemoration of the memory of the Korean War. But when the relationship is negative, Beijing try to maximize the occasion, to utilize the occasion to maximize the anti-US sentiment, to unify internal differences, and also to send signals to the United States. So if you ask me that what Xi Jinping's key message this year has been, I think there are two messages. The first one is a warning to the United States, a deterrence message that don't take more actions on Taiwan and South China Sea. Otherwise, well, we fought a war to end the wars with the United States when we were weak and we didn't lose. When we were basically less than a year old. Now it's 17 years later, we're not going to lose either. So I think the first message is this message of deterrence or warning to the United States. And the internal message from Xi is to boost the morale and to boost the unified opinion in China, that because now there are people in China who question that, well, is China on the wrong course in terms of its policy with the United States? Is China being too assertive? Is China going to lose in this trade war or in this war over semiconductor chips? So I think Xi's message to the domestic audience is that do not be afraid. We won 17 years ago, we're not going to lose this time either. So we have the national capacity and we have the national resolve to sustain this war of attrition with the United States. So those are the two messages.
Okay, great. All right, thank you very much. Your insights have been very good in this time. The speech was one that got a lot of attention in the activities, and so being able to think through with you, what to make of it was extremely helpful to me and the audience, I'm sure. So thank you. I will not ask you about tomorrow's election. No, forget it. We'll just wait for that to happen all by itself. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.